Imagine standing on the bank of a prehistoric river just as the first light of dawn spills across the water. The air is cool, the current is alive, and beneath the shimmering surface, thousands of fish push upstream in an endless migration. They are so densely packed that the river itself seems to move with them. There are no fishing rods, no hooks, no woven nets, no boats waiting offshore. Yet for the people watching from the riverbank, this annual spectacle is more than a marvel of nature. It is an opportunity to survive. Today, it is easy to picture our ancient ancestors as relentless hunters chasing mammoths across frozen plains with stone-tipped spears. Popular culture has turned prehistoric life into a story dominated by massive game animals, but that image leaves out one of humanity's oldest and most dependable food sources. Long before agriculture transformed the landscape, and long before sophisticated fishing gear appeared, our ancestors were already learning to exploit rivers, lakes, and coastlines in remarkably effective ways. So, how did prehistoric humans catch fish long before hooks, nets, or even boats existed? The answer reaches back almost 2 million years into a time before our own species had even evolved. Along the way, those seemingly simple meals may have provided nutrients that fueled the growth of larger brains, encouraged new technologies, and helped shape the evolutionary path that eventually led to us. The earliest chapters of this story were surprisingly simple. There is no evidence that our distant ancestors began with carefully crafted fishing equipment or elaborate hunting strategies. Instead, they likely took advantage of moments when nature made aquatic animals easy to catch. During seasonal droughts, shrinking rivers and isolated pools could leave fish crowded into shallow water, struggling to escape. Turtles moved slowly along muddy banks, while stranded shellfish required little more than curious hands to collect. For an observant hominin, these were opportunities too valuable to ignore. Some of the oldest evidence comes from East Turkana in Kenya, where a site dating to about 1.95 million years ago preserves butchered remains of catfish, turtles, and even the foot of a crocodile. Stone flakes found alongside the bones carry the unmistakable signs of butchery, suggesting that these early humans, or perhaps their close relatives living before Homo erectus, were already processing aquatic animals as part of their diet. The crocodile was probably scavenged rather than hunted, but the fish and turtles may have been caught with nothing more than speed, patience, and careful timing. Catfish were especially important. Unlike many freshwater species, they can survive in warm, oxygen-poor pools where other fish cannot. As water levels dropped during the dry season, they became trapped in increasingly confined spaces, making them remarkably easy to capture by hand. Long before the first spear entered the archaeological record, the human body itself was likely the original fishing tool. These catches offered far more than an easy meal. Fish, turtles, shellfish, and other aquatic animals are exceptionally rich in protein, healthy fats, iodine, and omega-3 fatty acids, nutrients that play a critical role in brain growth and development. While no single food transformed human evolution on its own, regular access to these nutrient-dense resources may have provided an important advantage as our ancestors' brains gradually increased in size. Fishing did not begin as a specialized craft. It began with sharp eyes, good timing, and a willingness to exploit every opportunity the landscape provided. Those simple decisions may have quietly influenced the course of human evolution long before anyone ever imagined making a hook or casting a net. As generations passed, simple opportunism gradually gave way to something more deliberate. Once our ancestors recognized that rivers and lakes could provide reliable food, the next logical step was finding ways to capture prey that stayed just beyond the reach of their hands. Wood, one of the most abundant materials in their environment, was the obvious choice. Although wooden spears rarely survive for hundreds of thousands of years, it is entirely possible that sharpened sticks were being used to pin fish in shallow water long before any direct evidence was preserved. The archaeological record begins to hint at this transition around 800,000 years ago at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. There, researchers uncovered an unfinished bone point carved with 3 curved barbs along its sides. Although it lacks signs of being attached to a shaft, its shape bears a striking resemblance to later harpoons used for spearing fish. We cannot say with certainty that this tool was intended for fishing, but if that interpretation is correct, it would represent one of the earliest known attempts to design a weapon specifically for catching aquatic animals rather than simply grabbing them by hand. Whoever crafted it belonged to Homo erectus, a species that had already spread across Africa and much of Eurasia. Far from being primitive wanderers, these humans were increasingly skilled toolmakers who adapted to an astonishing range of environments. Their camps are often found near rivers, lakes, and coastlines, where shellfish and freshwater resources became regular parts of their diet. As they explored these habitats, they were also learning that different environments demanded different solutions. One remarkable discovery comes from Trinil on the Indonesian island of Java. Between 540,000 and 450,000 years ago, a freshwater shell was deliberately engraved with a series of neat geometric lines. It is the oldest known engraving made by any hominin. The shell had first been opened to remove the animal inside, demonstrating that Homo erectus was harvesting shellfish for food, but someone later took the time to carve an abstract pattern into its surface. Whether it reflected curiosity, creativity, or simple experimentation remains unknown. What is clear is that interactions with aquatic environments were becoming about far more than survival. Rivers and shorelines had become places where technology, observation, and perhaps even the first sparks of symbolic thought evolved together. For decades, Neanderthals have been portrayed as specialists in one thing: hunting enormous Ice Age mammals. The familiar image is almost always the same: stocky hunters confronting mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, or bison across frozen grasslands. While they were undoubtedly capable big-game hunters, this stereotype has obscured another side of their lives. Many Neanderthal communities lived beside rivers and coastlines, and the archaeological evidence increasingly shows they took full advantage of the food those environments offered. Along the Mediterranean coast and the Atlantic shores of what is now Portugal, caves once occupied by Neanderthals have preserved an astonishing collection of marine remains. At Figueira Brava, researchers uncovered hundreds of shells from several species of shellfish, alongside the butchered bones of monk seals, ringed seals, and bottlenose dolphins. The shellfish present little mystery. At low tide, many could have been gathered directly from exposed rocks, much like coastal foragers still do today. Seals may have been ambushed while resting on beaches or caught in shallow water. Dolphins are more puzzling. Some were probably scavenged after washing ashore, although hunting animals trapped near the coastline cannot be ruled out entirely. Their menu was not limited to the sea. Inland sites reveal that Neanderthals also harvested freshwater species including trout, chub, eel, European perch, and even Black Sea salmon. Rivers offered a dependable source of food that changed with the seasons, providing opportunities that complemented rather than replaced large-game hunting. Instead of relying on a single strategy, Neanderthals appear to have adapted their diets to whatever their local environment provided. One of the most intriguing clues comes not from their tools, but from their skeletons. Many Neanderthal skulls exhibit a condition known today as surfer's ear, where repeated exposure to cold water causes bony growths to develop inside the ear canal. Modern surfers, divers, and cold water swimmers commonly develop the same condition. While this does not prove Neanderthals regularly dived beneath the waves, it strongly suggests that many spent considerable time in chilly coastal waters. Combined with the enormous quantities of shellfish found at their campsites, the evidence points toward people who were comfortable entering the water rather than simply collecting food from the shoreline. In many ways, their behavior resembles that of recent coastal hunter-gatherers more than the outdated image of relentless mammoth hunters. Like traditional foraging societies from Australia, southern Africa, or the Pacific coast of the Americas, Neanderthals seem to have viewed the shoreline as a diverse pantry rather than a place visited only in desperation. The more archaeologists investigate these ancient coasts, the clearer it becomes that seafood was not an occasional supplement to their diet. For some communities, it was an essential part of everyday life, setting the stage for an even greater expansion of aquatic resource use when our own species began spreading across the globe. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, the relationship between humans and water had changed dramatically. Rivers and coastlines were no longer places where people simply gathered whatever happened to be within reach. They had become predictable sources of food that could be visited again and again. As knowledge accumulated over thousands of generations, fishing evolved from opportunistic foraging into an organized strategy that communities could depend upon. Some of the clearest evidence comes from the southern coast of Africa. At Pinnacle Point, archaeological layers dating back roughly 160,000 years contain abundant shellfish remains, showing that early modern humans repeatedly returned to the shoreline to harvest marine resources. These visits were not random. They required an understanding of tides, seasons, and the behavior of coastal animals. People had begun planning around the rhythms of the sea, treating it as a reliable provider rather than a fortunate discovery. That trend continued at Blombos Cave, where sites dating to around 70,000 years ago reveal a remarkable collection of artifacts. Alongside shellfish remains are carefully shaped bone tools, finely worked stone points, shell beads, and evidence of symbolic engraving. Marine fish, seals, penguins, and seabirds all formed part of the local diet. The sophistication of these tools suggests that technological innovation was accelerating alongside a growing mastery of coastal environments. As people refined their equipment, they also became more efficient at exploiting an increasingly diverse range of aquatic resources. Perhaps the most striking evidence comes from Katanga, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Here, archaeologists uncovered several beautifully crafted barbed bone harpoons dating to approximately 90,000 years ago. Unlike earlier bone points whose purpose remains uncertain, these were unmistakably designed for fishing. Their size and construction matched the giant catfish that inhabited the nearby river system, some weighing more than 60 kilograms. A single successful catch could feed dozens of people, making these seasonal harvests enormously valuable. Researchers believe groups may have returned to the same fishing grounds year after year, timing their visits with the annual movements of these massive fish. If so, this represents something profoundly different from simply reacting to whatever food happened to be available. It reflects planning, shared knowledge, and the passing of specialized skills from one generation to the next. Children would have learned where the fish gathered, when the rivers changed, and how to craft and use the distinctive harpoons long before they became hunters themselves. Reliable coastal and freshwater resources may also have helped support larger human populations. Unlike migrating herds that could disappear over the horizon, shellfish beds, productive estuaries, and seasonal fish runs offered food that was both predictable and renewable. Communities able to exploit these environments were less dependent on the uncertainties of big game hunting, giving them greater stability as they expanded across new landscapes. Mastering the water was no longer just another survival skill. It had become one of the foundations that allowed our species to flourish. Once early Homo sapiens learned that coastlines could provide dependable food, those shores became something even more valuable. They became highways. Instead of acting as barriers, the edges of continents offered fresh water, shellfish, fish, seabirds, and predictable navigation routes. Following the coastline meant following survival, and as our species began expanding beyond Africa between roughly 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, those aquatic landscapes likely guided one of the greatest migrations in human history. Imagine leaving familiar territory and entering lands no human ancestors had ever explored. Hunting unfamiliar animals deep inland carried enormous risks, but the coast offered something reassuringly consistent. Every bay, estuary, and river mouth held resources that people already understood how to exploit. The knowledge accumulated over countless generations in Africa could now be applied thousands of kilometers away. Rather than beginning from scratch in every new environment, migrating groups carried with them an adaptable strategy built around water. This helps explain the astonishing speed with which modern humans spread across southern Asia. Within only a few thousand years, they had reached Southeast Asia, eventually arriving in Australia between about 65,000 and 50,000 years ago. This journey was impossible without crossing stretches of open water. Even when sea levels were much lower during the Ice Age, the continents of Sunda and Sahel were never completely connected. At some point, people had to leave the safety of the shore and venture across the sea using some form of watercraft. We do not know exactly what those vessels looked like. They may have been simple rafts made from logs, bundles of bamboo, or other organic materials that have long since disappeared. Yet their existence is written into the geography itself. Evidence from Jeremalai Cave on the island of Timor reveals just how comfortable these people had become with marine environments. Archaeologists recovered nearly 38,000 fish bones from the site, many belonging to fast-swimming pelagic species such as tuna. These fish spend much of their lives in the open ocean rather than hugging the coastline. Catching them is no simple task. Even today, tuna are prized for their speed, strength, and endurance. Their presence suggests that humans living here more than 40,000 years ago possessed remarkably sophisticated maritime knowledge. Exactly how they caught these fish remains uncertain. Spears may have been used near the surface, while simple boats could have allowed fishermen to reach deeper waters. Fish hooks appear at the site only much later, around 23,000 years ago, but that does not mean earlier people lacked effective techniques. Successful fishing depends as much on understanding tides, currents, migration routes, and animal behavior as it does on the tools themselves. By mastering aquatic environments, early Homo sapiens gained far more than another source of food. They unlocked an entire network of connected coastlines that stretched across continents and islands. Rivers became pathways into the interior, while the sea itself transformed from an obstacle into a bridge. Humanity's expansion across the globe was not simply a triumph of endurance or intelligence, it was also the story of a species that learned to read the water and trust it to lead the way. As the last ice age gradually came to an end around 12,000 years ago, landscapes across the northern hemisphere were transformed. Retreating glaciers carved countless new lakes and rivers, while rising sea levels flooded coastal valleys to create rich estuaries teeming with fish. For communities adapting to these changing environments, aquatic resources became more dependable than ever. The challenge was no longer simply finding fish, it was catching them efficiently enough to feed growing populations. This period witnessed an explosion of fishing technology. Bone and antler fish hooks became increasingly common across Europe and parts of Asia, carefully shaped to hold struggling prey once they swallowed the bait. Woven nets, weighted with stone sinkers and supported by wooden floats, allowed entire schools of fish to be captured at once. Along rivers, people constructed fish weirs, carefully arranged fences of stakes and branches that funneled migrating fish into narrow channels where they could be collected with little effort. During harsh northern winters, communities even learned to cut holes through thick ice, lowering lines into the dark water below long before the first written histories described the practice. What makes this technological revolution especially remarkable is that it did not spread from a single place. Similar solutions appeared independently in different parts of the world. Indigenous communities in northern Europe built elaborate river weirs, while people in Japan developed finely crafted shellfish hooks. Along the Pacific coast of the Americas, wooden traps and tidal fish fences harvested enormous seasonal runs of salmon. In Australia, Aboriginal communities engineered sophisticated stone fish traps that directed water through carefully designed channels. Each culture responded to its own environment, yet many arrived at strikingly similar inventions because they were solving the same fundamental problem. These innovations dramatically increased the amount of food a single community could obtain. Instead of relying entirely on daily hunting success, people could harvest large quantities of fish during seasonal migrations and preserve them through drying or smoking for months ahead. Food became more predictable, reducing the constant uncertainty that had shaped human life for hundreds of thousands of years. That reliability changed far more than diet. Productive rivers, lakes, and coastlines encouraged people to remain in one place for longer periods. Camps gradually became villages, and some villages evolved into permanent settlements anchored beside dependable fisheries. Larger populations could be supported, knowledge became easier to pass between generations, and increasingly specialized crafts emerged. Long before agriculture dominated much of the world, abundant fisheries had already demonstrated that a stable food supply could transform the way humans lived. The story that began with someone reaching into a shrinking pool to grasp a stranded fish had come full circle. Across thousands of generations, simple, opportunistic foraging had evolved into one of humanity's most sophisticated and influential technologies. Fishing was no longer merely a means of surviving another day. It had become one of the foundations upon which complex human societies would eventually be built. Looking back across nearly 2 million years, it is remarkable how modest this story began. There were no boats waiting on the shoreline, no woven nets stretched across rivers, and no carefully forged hooks hidden in tackle boxes. There were only observant ancestors standing beside shrinking pools, discovering that a stranded catfish or a handful of shellfish could mean the difference between hunger and survival. What started as simple opportunism slowly became knowledge. That knowledge became technology. And over countless generations, those technologies transformed the relationship between humans and water, forever. Along the way, fishing helped nourish expanding brains with nutrient-rich food. It encouraged new tools, from sharpened wooden spears to finely crafted bone harpoons. It drew Neanderthals to rocky coastlines, guided Homo sapiens along the shores of Africa and Asia, and may even have helped carry our species across open seas into entirely new continents. Rivers became pathways of exploration, coastlines became migration routes, and reliable fisheries allowed some of the first permanent communities to take root long before agriculture reshaped the world. Perhaps that is why the history of fishing is really the history of human adaptability. Every new environment demanded fresh ideas, and every generation inherited the discoveries of those who came before. From icy northern rivers to tropical coral reefs, people repeatedly learned to understand the rhythms of water rather than struggle against them. The techniques differed, but the lesson remained the same. Survival belongs to those who could read the currents, anticipate the seasons, and work with nature instead of against it. Today, whether someone casts a modern carbon fiber fishing rod into a quiet lake or watches a float drift down a river, they are participating in a tradition that stretches back almost unimaginably far. Hidden inside every hook, every net, every boat, and every cast is the accumulated experience of millions of years of observation, experimentation, failure, and success. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the instinct that first drew our ancestors to the water's edge remains exactly the same. A timeless reminder that some of humanity's greatest achievements began with nothing more than curiosity, patience, and the search for the next meal.